lead a panel that I'm pretty excited about, smart management for robust carrier health and reduced TCO. So I'd like to invite Michelle up here. Thanks.
Thank you, Dave. So I'll just start with the slides. Okay. So as the title says, we are looking at smart management, and our goal is to look at how can we improve the health of the operator's network and help them reduce cost of ownership. And let's just move on. So the first question, of course, is, well, before I start, I'd like to thank the program committee of NANOG, in particular, several members who gave me a very good feedback. Tony Tauber is right here. He was very instrumental in helping us fine-tune this. But there were also other members, Mike Sinatra, Ted Dendy, Mohit Lad, and Dave Temkin himself, and Tom Scholl, who all provided feedback in the initial stages. So thanks to all of them, and thanks to everybody here for being for the panel. So let's start by asking, why are we looking at network management? So what are the evolution trends in data, consumer behavior, technology that are driving the need for better management? And I've listed some of them here. Well, we all know that networks are converging to all IP-based networks. There's a lot of focus on carrier Ethernet services, which are becoming popular. We are even talking about MPLS-TP as extending packet-based management all the way to the access. And data volumes are exploding. We all understand that, driven by video and multimedia. In fact, a study by British Telecoms showed that 44% of the time of consumers today is spent on content, of all kinds, video, music, movies, news. And so there's a need also to look at the services that we are offering. So there's a service layer, and there's a need to manage those network services in addition to managing our network itself. And then why is that network managed? So that's the kind of the background of why management is important, but then why is it more important today than before? So, and what is the cost, in fact, of not having a proper management system or our capabilities, tools, etc., all in place? Well, the first is convergence is great, but it means less equipment, but also means that you have more functionality per system. So a failure or a misconfiguration in the network is that much more expensive, because multiple services at multiple levels can be affected by that. And management is key for that. And the cost of not having proper management is very high. It impacts OPEX, it impacts revenues, and affects profitability. In fact, there was a study done by Velcor, or Telcordia, which showed that even for operators having networks as small as 100 devices, to operators having networks with many thousands of devices, there is still a cost associated with bad management and having faults and problems in your network that ranges from just a few $100,000 to all the way going to millions of dollars. So that's an expensive process. So what are the problems? Well, you can have configuration loopholes, configuration errors, improper auditing of what you've configured, and a lack of a consolidated view of your entire network infrastructure, which can be really, really expensive. And in fact, the panel today is going to address exactly some of these issues. So what's our purpose here today? Well, we'd like to make it very interactive. We want to explore and discuss and then debate a set of issues that all focus on better management of the network. And from two components. Of course, we want to operate a healthy network. And the moment you make a healthy network, you're obviously going to reduce your cost of ownership, as I just discussed. And we are very fortunate to have an excellent panel this morning. We have three different perspectives that we're going to bring to you. There's going to be operators, and in fact, we have three different kinds of operators. There's a tier one, there's a content-centric operator, and an emerging operator, which I'll introduce all in a minute. We have the system vendor perspective, and then we have a software provider perspective. So the entire ecosystem is represented here, and we're going to discuss, you're going to hear the viewpoints of the ecosystem players, and then we have an opportunity to talk and debate, what is it that is being done well by the ecosystem, what are the missing pieces, what are the best practices, and hopefully the takeaways will help members of the audience as they look at their network management strategies, as they evolve their networks, which I know many of us are doing today. So the focus in particular is on configuration management and verifying that the equipment and services are all configured right and that we can identify misconfigurations. So as you can imagine, there are many components to network management. And to keep the discussion focused this morning, we're going to focus on one component, which we call config management. And even in that, we're going to use a top-down approach. So we're going to start initially, and now I'll introduce the panelists. We have Bruce Katzell here from Amatus, and we're going to start with Bruce's presentation where he talks about service and configuration management coming from at the very top, over the network elements. And then once he's kind of introduced that and the motivations for looking at management, we'll go into the presentations of the three operators. So we'll start with Sean Morris of NTT America, who's going to talk about what approaches NTT America has taken, what lessons they've learned in the last 10 years of doing that very systematically and organically, and what are the takeaways for the audience here. And then we'll come to Jay Moran of AOL, who's going to talk about AOL's specific approach, which of course involves dealing with a lot of content, and what tools and techniques AOL has developed to do that. And we're going to dive right in to the discussion of some of those tools in Jay's presentation. And then we're going to go to Bob Bender of CTS Telecom, who's going to talk to us from an emerging operator perspective. They're a small operator. They may not have all the things in place that the large operators have, but they are evolving their services, which may be true of many people in the audience here. And what approach have they used? What do they have? Do they not have? And so forth. And we're going to round that off with Colby Barth, who's going to come from Juniper's perspective or vendor perspective and talk about, well, what's going on in on-the-box management. So management, even configuration and auditing is, as you can see, an interplay of three things. You're looking at the network itself, you're looking at the systems in the networks, and finally we're looking at the services that we're overlaying on top of the network and how we're going to manage those. So without any further ado, I'd like to get started with the presenters. I'll invite Bruce up here. And we need the slides for Bruce, please. So this is the clicker. Forward and back. This is forward. Yeah. Okay.
Good morning, everybody. I'm just going to wait for my slides to come up. I thought it was supposed to be sunny in California, but I guess it's not this time of year. What's very good about the setup that Michelle has put forward, obviously, the perspective that you want to look at is on the network configuration side. And what I'm going to bring forward this morning for a few minutes is really more on the service configuration side. And so let's just take a look at some of the service configuration and some of the drivers that we're looking at today. And I'm sure in this room there is equipment manufacturers, there are service providers. And if you look at the environment today, let's kind of take a step back. And in many cases, the environment has not changed. In many cases, the environment's changing rapidly all the time. So if you take a look at things the way they are today, what are we talking about? There's a tremendous, greatly accelerated pace of change. If you look on the left-hand side of this slide, you're looking at the traditional service provider. You're looking at fixed costs, fixed terms, operator provision services. Then we're looking at service innovation. I mean, I think everybody can ask themselves in this room, where is this thing going to? We've seen incredible changes in the last 10 years, last 5 years, in the last year. So if you look to the right-hand side, we look at the future service provider, and you look at unified communications, business apps. Some of these vendors are actually in this room today. Where this is going, no one knows. But what we do know, that the change is just incredible, and keeping up with this change becomes a real problem. And so that's why we want to make sure that we put models going forward to be able to handle these changes. Because we all know there's a growing need for pay-per-use demand services. So these are some of the service configurations and audit drivers that I think that everybody in this room definitely recognizes as being present today. What I truly believe is a definitely lack of service awareness. If you take a look at the traditional OSS service automation gap, there's a tremendous problems that can exist in the marketplace today. I believe there's a lack of service awareness, lack of automation, high cost of ownership, and obviously all that delayed cost of ownership causes delayed opportunities and opportunities rollout. And if you look at the requirement side of the map here, I think everyone in this room is coming across this on a daily basis. The requirements are rapid rollout of services and technologies. Very, very important here. One thing that we are looking at on the software side is a standard mechanism to design and deliver all these service configurations. Very key point, where in the past we are talking about on this panel today network configuration management, how important that is to set everything in motion. But there is also service configuration management that goes hand in hand to that. And I think what you need to think in mind, because it's very important, you want to put together standard mechanisms because you want to be able to audit. And most importantly, you want to be able to reconcile your service configurations. And obviously, this all runs hand in hand to be able to do supporting for all your dynamic on-demand services. And so you want to be also for your partners and for all the partners and your customers, make all these services available in an open way in a very precise automated service. Now, if you look at this, this is kind of the overview way and the best practices in the best worlds and the TMF models and the MEF models that are out that everybody is probably aware of. Some of the best practice service fulfillment plans are the following. You are defining your service. Obviously, if you look at the left-hand side of the service. On the bottom layer, you have your traditional BSS mediation layer, kind of the telemanagement forum, the MTOSI model that I'm sure that you're aware of. So you define the mediation of that service. Then you're creating a template. Very, very important. You're creating templates to be able to give your best practice in service fulfillment going forward. So once you have that in mind, what's the next step? Obviously, you're creating the service. And when you're creating that service, you're making sure that your design portion of it has already been put in place on your service configuration side. Very important. Then obviously you're activating your service to your customers or to your partners. If you kind of take a look at that overall, I know I went over that very, very quickly. It's important that you really get everything in order. Some of you have legacy systems that you have built. Some of you have purchased OSS software in place. But it really is important on the configuration side, and Michelle touched on this a few minutes ago, that it's important that your network configurations are in place. I believe it's equally important to have your service configurations models put in place with your service catalog for your service activation and for your service fulfillment. This is kind of a very generic case study that could apply to just about anybody. In this particular case, it's really more on a small service provider, which some of you might be. But if you look at the panel that we have today, I think the benefits really kind of go across the board. It's pretty standardized. You're standardizing your service rollout mechanism. Obviously, you're being first to be able to introduce to market new services. Very important, especially if you're in a competitive situation. You never want to be behind the 8 ball. You want to be the one who actually can get the services out quickly. And obviously, going along with that, you want to be able to standardize your service offerings. The tremendous savings that exist and revenue savings that exist. Going back to what I was saying a few minutes ago, you have an automated service delivery mechanism, the removal of kind of the swivel chair mechanism that goes on time and time again. You're trying to simplify all your configurations together so you're not recreating the wheel time and time again. You're greatly reducing your errors. Very important. I think that if you look at yourself and some of the service offerings, if you are a service provider in this room, that's something you definitely want to take a look at. As far as savings, I think you know what the savings are. Everybody's ROI is slightly different. If you're a small carrier, medium carrier, or large carrier, you all are experiencing that type of information. But the most important thing here is that you want to be proactive on your insurance side, that you want to make sure that you're hitting your SLA performance issues to your customers, your bronze, your gold, your silver, etc. There's tremendous savings by getting everything together. But most importantly, it's the differentiates of your service offerings, and that is going to directly impact your company in the revenue pocketbook. Also important is open access for your customers and for your partners. There's many pieces, parts, and players that play into service assurance and service fulfillment and service configuration. So I think it's important to ask yourself what you have in place today, what you're planning to get in place in the future. But our vision, my vision, and I think the vision of this panel, is on the configuration side, is to get everything in place. Thank you for your time this morning.
So what we're going to do is we're going to hold the questions after you've heard the views of all the panelists and you've got a perspective, then we'll get into the discussion and the Q&A part. So I'd like to invite Sean Morris next from NTT America. Sean Morris, please. And Sean's going to talk to us about what NTT's approach has been over the last 10 years and what they've learned.
Thanks, Michelle. So I'd like to give you an overview of the configuration tools that we use in the NTT Global IP network. So first of all, what is it? Most of you know it as AS2914, the former Vario backbone. And this is a marketing map, but it's accurate. As of sometime in the fourth quarter, we're now up over 600 gigs on the Japan-US stuff. And one of the reasons I want to show you that is because if you look back to this map from 2004, you can see the kind of growth that we've had to manage over the last 7+ years. We've got almost a 40x increase in trans-Pacific bandwidth, and one of the ways that we've really been able to manage that growth is by leveraging this configuration tool system. So the global IP network, where does it fit within NTT? It's the wholesale IP transit network for NTT. We have about 150 plus IBGP nodes, 70 plus of those are running in a full mesh RSVP-TE setup. We have roughly about 200 other configure devices that are managed by the config tools, things like switches, out-of-band routers, routers that front end our SLA system, and various things like that. The bulk of our customer ports at this point is 10 gig E or N by 10 gig for a lot of customers. And that there's way more 10 gig ports in our network now than any other port. So, the philosophy about how we run the network, as you guys know, every year there is further compression in transit pricing, much to a lot of your benefit. But for us, then we have to manage the underlying costs to, we like to make money. So one way that we do that is by using a high degree of automation. So an overview of what these config tools are, it's all SQL database driven, and then that data is actually taken out of the database, derived through a set of platform specific templates, whether it's XR, iOS, Junos. We still have support for Procket OS in there. Of course, we're not actively developing that, but and then all the configuration is driven from the server. The server is canonical. There's no persistent configuration on the devices. No one in our network operations is allowed to type write mem on an iOS-based device. We push the config from disk, so for iOS devices, changes to the running config would be copy and pasted, but we actually push out, we do a copy FTP start and replace the startup config from disk. And then in the case of platforms that support a more advanced config methodology, such as XR and Junos, actually push the entire, if there's a config change, somebody makes the change on the server, and then the entire configuration is pushed from the server to the router, and the entire config is applied. And there's a text file per device on the configuration server, so if you have some kind of manual configuration that you need to do a hack, or if there's some kind of temporary configuration that needs to be supported and is not currently supported by the templates, it can be put into the text file. So what's in the database? Basically everything at this point, anything that is a variable configuration for the device is stored in the database. So you have all your management stuff, your SNMP community, so on and so forth. Your interfaces, all the interface config resides in there, all of our MPLS config, and then all the routing, the IP routing config. So what are the requirements from a router perspective? SSH. We have not moved to any kind of XML-based interface as of yet. The ability for the device to go out and actually retrieve the configuration file from the host via FTP. Commit, rollback, and then roll forward. So roll forward is a term that Jared Mauch actually coined for the ability of a device to take in an arbitrary configuration, process the config, remove what needs to be removed, apply what needs to be applied, and so forth. For devices that don't support that model, such as iOS, we'd need the ability to replace the startup configuration on the device directly. So if you go down this route, what kind of things can you do? Well, stuff that basically everybody does, automatic updates of BGP ACLs and max prefix counts. We have a tool for iOS devices that will spit out all the relevant configuration for either a customer or a peer. The interface config, the BGP peer config, all the policy, and then that can actually just be, we do a copy FTP run and put that right in, and then you don't have to rely on anybody to cut and paste and worry that they missed a term from a route map or anything like that. We can do a mass update of our RSVP TE LSPs. We are not running auto bandwidth, so that's still important for us. And then you get into the stuff that's really powerful, bulk move of interfaces and sub-interfaces. It's very easy for an operator to move, say, a channelized DS3 or a Ethernet trunk with, tens or hundreds of VLANs on it in a single operation. In the last 2 years, we've swapped out almost all of our customer-facing ports in the U.S. onto ASR 9000s. It wasn't uncommon for us to move 20 plus 10 gig connections in a 3-hour window with no resulting outages. Then you can seed your other systems with data, whether it's stats or monitoring, business intelligence systems, and then you can get into complex configurations across multiple devices. So if, for instance, you had a switch accommodating low-speed customers, you could have one tool that will let you configure the IP port on the router, the trunk port on the switch, and the customer-facing switch port, and make sure that all your parameters are in sync, whether it's MTUs, ACLs on the front end and the back end, your IP addressing, your VLAN IDs. You can make sure that everything's consistent across multiple devices. So what are the additional benefits for doing this? Lower staffing. We run a pretty lean staff for the size of the network that we run. Lower error rates, doesn't eliminate errors. At the end of the day, we still have humans running the network, but it also has a lower risk of catastrophic errors. Since people are applying configurations that are generated out of the system, it would be very hard, for instance, somebody in our network would really have to go out of their way to do something like redistribute BGP into IGP or things of that nature. Rapid service delivery and migration, like I said, it allows us to do a high number of move, add, change activities quickly and at a really low error rate. Minimize peer review. I talk to a lot of our customers, and they tell me that they spend a lot of time peer reviewing configuration changes. And we do peer review as well. That's obviously an important step, but for us, the bulk of the peer review actually happens at the time the templates are generated. So then once the templates are generated, it's very easy to let people push out changes to peering and those kind of things, because for the most part, it's very hard for them to generate configurations that are out of scope because they're using a templated config. Config consistency, I'm sure a lot of you struggle with making sure that all your devices are configured the same way. Your VTI, ACLs are all in sync, all your SNMP information is in sync, things of that nature. And then reporting. Essentially, at this point now, we have an SQL database that has the bulk of our device configurations in it. So you can pull out all kinds of reports very quickly and easily about what's configured in your network. So that's great for NTT, right? We probably took $2 million of money from Tokyo or something and built this system, right? Not really. This system grew organically over the past, probably over 15 years. It started back before the Vario days, and it was really just started as a tool for the engineers to make their job easier and also to deliver better service. And so it was not a fully funded project. It was something that was just started by the network engineering organization. The development was done by network engineers, development engineers, and ops engineers as part of their job. Now we do have 3 full-time software engineers that work on this, 2 of whom are former network engineers. But you can get started on this stuff incrementally and organically, and I think that's an important point. So, and now just finally a couple of quick lessons learned. If you go down this route, avoid those I told you can make a manual configuration in our system, but really you should avoid doing those kind of hacks and one-off configurations at all costs, because inevitably what happens is you have this one-off configuration, and to be honest, it sits there kind of like a time bomb, because eventually you're going to have a change in one of your templates or a change in the router software or something, and these changes are much harder, or these hacks are much harder to audit. And eventually something's going to happen and you're going to have a change and it's going to conflict with the hack and you're going to have an outage. And you still need auditing. We still run Rancid to collect all our device configurations and watch for actual changes in the network. And we have a large number of reports that run against the database and against the running configs on iOS-based devices to look for differences between what's configured in the tools versus what's configured in the running configs. And then also a bunch of reports that look at just things that are generally, they may be configured within scope within the capabilities of the tools, but they're not configured within scope in the way that we want to run the network.
Great. Thank you, Sean. I'm going to bring in Jay Moran of AOL next. He's going to give you a different perspective, diving deeper into how they're doing things. Jay's presentation. Jay Moran.
Good morning, everyone, or good afternoon for everyone still on East Coast time like myself. AOL's changed quite a bit over the years. We certainly were a dial-up ISP back in the day with about 32 million dial-up customers, subscribers. That number shrunk to about 10% of that base, and frankly, we've moved to the content side of the world, and advertising is our primary mechanism for generating revenue. So that doesn't necessarily mean that everything went away that we had back in the day. So we still have a pretty large network, about 500 routers, 6,000-ish switches, 40,000 physical machines, about 15,000 virtuals, and the virtuals increasing at a very rapid rate, which also changes the pace of the network needs as well as overall system needs of the company. Still have the backbone, ATDN, across the US and Europe for most of our peering purposes, as well as getting data between our 5 data centers. And then that's the core of what we have to do. These are some of the problems that we actually end up facing. So we still have the largest scale. We still have lots of multiple network vendors. We have mostly standardized on Juniper devices at this point, but we still have a lot of Brocade out there, a lot of Arista that's coming into the network, some Dell, HP, Cisco, and even potentially if you're looking at overall configuration management and auditing and things like that, the L4 through 7 stuff. So the NetScalers, the A10s, the Brocade ADXs, those stuff can also be put into your CMDB or other places. So pretty wide scope of things to look at. Each thing we decide to do, whether it's off the shelf or internally developed, we do an ROI on. We want to make sure that we're not wasting the developer's time, because that's a precious resource, and make sure we're also not just throwing money at a vendor who won't give us exactly what we need. And what we've always noticed, and I think sure everybody else has as well, is the integration cost and time of a COTS solution often ends up equaling or outgrowing what you could have done in-house if you just done it yourself. So that's some of the big challenges. A couple of other big challenges we have are a combination of human at the CLI as well as the system-driven configuration. So much like NGT was talking about, we have the systems that generate configuration or portions of the configurations, but we still have people on the boxes making configuration changes. Keeping those things in sync and making sure that you're not bitten by something that wasn't documented properly or followed up on or put into the system of record can certainly be a challenge. So anything you're doing has to be constantly in sync between the systems. From an organizational perspective, there's actually some organizational things that actually hinder or help, or however you want to describe it, from the actual network itself. And so we have a NOC and attack, which handles mostly operations work, but they are helping us with a lot of the actual day-to-day deployments and things like that. And we have the engineering and architecture organization, who spends a lot more of their time actually deploying new things or changing things or moving us forward. So that organizational separation, you got to keep that in mind when you're looking at your tooling situation. And then we also have a central infrastructure development org. We've tied as many of our network tools as we can into that. We still have a long ways to go there, but that central organization has a lot of benefits from just having a larger development pool of resources that can actually go code for you, as well as tying information together. Primary tool that we use, I'll give a little overview of all of our different tools, is Simian. Frankly, it's what we're moving into. We've used it for a very long time to manage our extremely complex ACL set, and that's how we deploy it on a lot of Cisco and Juniper devices and some Brocade devices. And at this point now, we're actually using that as our basis to throw all of our new tools against. It's based on the Twisted framework for Python. It's a multi-threaded, event-driven framework that can automatically go across all 500 devices or however many devices you have to push configs, react to the configuration changes and things like that. It's all in Python, so we have lots of Perl scripts, Bash scripts, other things that engineers have written over the years, and we're now migrating those into that. So basically, leverage what other folks have done across the entire organization. It's very driver-based, so we don't go out and write how to interact with the Juniper device for every single script. It's all in there in one location. It really helps on the configuration ease across large changes or big changes or changes that happen on a regular basis. The one thing we still definitely need from our vendors, though, common set of interfaces, whether it's netconf or whatever else, or just standardized XML. We have to have something other than just CLI-driven configuration management. Very importantly, Simian will tie, I should have said will tie, not ties, to the rest of our tools. We have some stuff in there for change management, things like that, but I'll talk about Orb and Remedy and other pieces that it needs to tie even more greatly into. For CMDB, or Configuration Management Database, and our asset management, Orb is internally developed. It's one of those tools that when people leave AOL, they're like, man, I wish I had that again. It's pretty cool. It's cool, but it's not cool from a wow factor. It's just a database of all the information we have about all the systems, applications, products, things out there that are configured throughout technology operations. We're adding more and more of the network gear into there to actually substantiate what we have in the network against the rest of the system information. It's generally integration at a project level, so you know if www.aol.com is a project, or www.engadget.com is a project, or the dial-up service, whatever else, or a subcomponent of it. You can see all the different components that are related to it, how they're configured, and how they should be configured. It's very easy to query and integrate against. It's MySQL over HTTP through the Atomics protocol, which is a protocol from CNET, open sourced a few years back. Makes it really easy for anybody that understands the data structure to just get the information they need out really quickly and do what they need to do with it. It's very key to our success at scale. I mean, we couldn't have done what we've done at the scale we have without it. Amos is our COTS asset management system. It kind of sucks. It's a pain in the butt. For whatever reason, the finance team likes it better than putting it in Orb. Personal opinion is we should just move it into Orb. Off-the-shelf configuration components, we don't do everything internally that's self-developed. Rancid, I think everybody has. We use it only generally for a break glass type of emergency situation. So it's our, in case we can't generate the configs automatically or get to the boxes, hopefully we can rebuild the network in case of emergencies through configuration backups inside of Rancid. And we can also see what's going on through a lot of that too, from a changes standpoint. Junos op scripts and commit scripts. We have Juniper boxes pretty much in the data center edge as well as the backbone. And then various boxes in between and specialized networks. But we use a lot of the op scripts. Well, we don't use a lot. We're starting to use more of the op scripts like op BGP status, one we wrote, to just summarize the BGP status information that we wanted to see when we wanted to see it instead of having to have multiple commands on Junos. It's also pretty good for replicating information through your commit scripts if you have a configuration that could actually be automated in some fashion. Syslog, Splunk, central syslogging, having all of the system devices, not just the network devices. It's about 60,000 devices, all syslogging to a central server. Event correlation, event management of those service, the syslogs that are coming inbound, all custom in-house developed. And then we also use Netcool for putting in front of the NOC team, as well as Splunk for just general viewing. Audit tools, we do buy some off-the-shelf stuff. Each of these things we make a decision. Is it cheaper to buy it off the shelf or try and do it yourself? We use Arbor for NetFlow, planning, visibility, and of course security. Carrot for planning, traffic engineering, as well as event simulation. And then we use Cyclops BGP Play to get that outside view. And then internally, I think two of the coolest tools that we have are Argus and Toga. Argus is the metrics collection system. It does about 40 million metrics from the systems a minute, as well as about 10 million metrics, SNMP metrics off of all the different hosts that it collects, whether it's network or systems. So about 50 million metrics being inserted every minute. Pretty massive number. I'm sure there's a couple people who have bigger, but it is interesting to see all that data all together at one time. And then in conjunction with Argus is the visualization aspect of that data, and that's Toga, another internally developed tool. Again, something that when people leave, they're like, wow, I really wish I had Toga and Argus and Orb wherever I'm going. And it's that data correlation and being able to view all of these statistics on one screen that you create in a real-time environment to see what you need when you need it. So if it's an outage situation, it really helps on the correlation of what's going on. If it's just planning purposes, if you're just looking for URLs per second from this website and this part of the network, what do you need to do to kind of scale those two things up together? And then from a packet capture capability, we've did a relatively straightforward, at least for multi-10 gig capture, solution. It's just cheap industry off-the-shelf servers, terabytes of storage, multi-10 gig NICs in each, cheap NICs. These aren't expensive NICs. These are all $500, $600 10 gig NICs. Hash the data across using Brocade MLXEs. Is basically 10 gig hubs that has some hashing capabilities across it. You get the data across a lot of the servers. You can store it. You can see it. You can really get some in-depth visibility when you need it. Or you can do other things with it if you want to as well. So takeaways, at least from my experience and AOL's experience, if your technology stack is how you make your revenue, we don't make $1 of revenue without it. You best invest in tooling, otherwise you're going to be sitting there wondering why this outage is costing millions of dollars for every minute that it's down, or however much your revenue line is. And I think even though it's the last line, I'll move it up to the kind of the most one of the most important things is investing in engineers who can help you automate. And even if your engineers can't automate, network engineers specifically, at least let them understand what it is that can be automated. So if they recognize something that could have been repeated through a script or a real full-blown tool or whatever else, make sure they can say, hey, look, can someone help me do this? So they're not doing the same work every day. And having engineers who kind of are protective of doing the same work every day aren't necessarily investing their skills or moving their skills forward, and it's certainly not helping you to keep your costs down. Keeping your silos out of the picture, even though we have multiple organizations, it's very important to drive the tooling set to be common across all the different organizations. And that gets challenging because it can be a political thing at sometimes. Prioritization is a very big aspect of this. The network is not necessarily the thing that's got the dollars of revenue directly tied to it, unless you're an ISP or service provider of that type. So it's kind of hard to sometimes justify writing this backend tool that will help you configure BGP better when you got another tool that needs to deploy 5,000 VMs a day instead of 1,000. So keeping that prioritization, keeping a common set of priorities across the organization, very important. Common frameworks for all your device drivers. Don't rewrite the same stuff over and over again. And then having the visibility across all of your technologies. It's a hard thing, but it's a very valuable thing if you can do it. So the bigger you get, the more valuable it becomes to have data that can be input from multiple sources and then shown against each other in order to actually make decisions with. And at scale, one of the reasons we ended up developing a lot of our stuff is once you get it to a certain number of devices, a lot of the COTS solutions are not very cost effective. They start becoming so expensive that you're actually spending more money on your tools than you actually are for the revenue that you're generating. It's unfortunate, and hopefully you have vendors that'll work with you on that one, but it's something to keep in mind. Of, when you make a decision, make sure you understand how it's going to impact at scale as well. And then just use an ROI. I've mentioned it a couple times. That's the most important thing, whether you need people to write the code or whether you need to actually go buy a piece of a tool, showing how you can actually get a return on that investment is pretty critical to actually getting it done. I think that's it for me.
Okay, wonderful. We're going to pull the time back a little bit, so I'll request Bob Bender to come up next, and then we have Colby Bath, but we're going to rush the presentation slides are all there, so I'm going to request the speakers to maybe go over the main points only, so we can get to more discussion-oriented stuff.
Morning. I'm Bob Bender with CTS Telecom, and we're a small provider in Southwest Lower Michigan. And at this point, we're a 100-year-old independent phone company. We're still literally a mom and pop. We've got revenues over 10 million. And at this point, our CLEC represents 90% of our revenues. We are also a ARRA, a federal broadband stimulus awardee, and so that allowed us to convert our legacy copper to fiber to the home this year. We have a pretty small network in terms of, but we have pretty small resources and staff also. We've got about a dozen 72 and 7300s, 3 ASR 9Ks, and we still have a lot of legacy platforms, so we are in the middle of a transition right now. So we still have a Lucent 5 ESS, we have a soft switch, we've got a couple Sonnet platforms, we have early first generation PON that went in 8 years ago. We're moving to a modern multi-service access service platform, consolidating all of our legacy access platforms. And then we've been real involved with carrier Ethernet. In fact, the ability to produce carrier Ethernet EVCs for customers has been a really important part of our business at this point. And we just really rely heavily on our hardware vendors. We just don't have scale, we don't have deep staff. So we basically have an SNMP console to kind of keep an eye on everything. We run a NetFlow monitor, which is incredibly helpful. And then we have all the different service managers for each of the elements. And but because we've still got a number of platforms that are legacy, we're kind of got a foot in both worlds. A lot of what we're focused on is we're dealing with a lot of end users. So we're putting hosted IP phones in sites. We have a large number of TDM IADs. We're doing IP voice gateways on leased Ts. And then we have, over 500 miles of fiber network, fiber to the premise. We run almost 100 SONET nodes. So we've really got a pretty diverse set of hardware we're trying to support. So a lot of what we're really, one of our base needs is just, if you lose an edge device, you've got to be able to replace those configs. So a lot of what we're focused on is just being able to effectively back up and restore configs in the event you lose an edge device. And Rancid is really the core of what we're doing for all of the aggregation and core IP. It allows us to track all of our changes. And we're still doing an awful lot of manual config because we just don't have scale to invest in a full-blown NMS and larger tool sets to automate those processes yet, although we're really starting to automate. And a good example of that would be as we've transitioned from our legacy Centrex services to hosted IP phones. It really would be impossible if we didn't have the templating that we do now. Fortunately, our soft switch manufacturer has a really excellent configure management system for the IP phones. It has full templating, so all the configs are consistent. When we first started, we were doing manual config, which was just impossible. And it's really been a nice thing for us moving ahead and trying to do our other pieces. And then finally, our hardware vendors are really stepping up and building decent software tools for us. So we're just implementing right now a new configuration management system for all of our voice IADs that will allow us to do firmware and config management, and that's going to be a huge help. That's one of our main projects for this year. And then as we're moving into all of our next generation optical, we've obviously got GPON, ONT in the ILEC. We're doing active Ethernet and carrier Ethernet in the CLEC. And so the new software tools, and they're just released, so we're just starting to get them implemented. But they really are a step forward for us. It'll help us to really automate those processes. So really the observations are, we've had to evolve or die. We're Climax Telephone. We're right in between two independent markets. So we've had to kind of reinvent ourselves. So initially, we were the second POP in the US for MCI. We've now evolved. We were the first CLEC in Michigan 15 years ago. And really now the CLEC is our day job. But as we've evolved the company so rapidly, we've also really had to now really look at our support infrastructures and figure out how do we build infrastructures, again, with limited resource and staff to help support all these new network services. And so one of the things that we'd like to try to do is, our intent is with Rancid is then now that we can start to do, audit those config files that we've pulled and build tools for that. We just haven't found any really affordable tools to do that at this point. And then the other problem we've got is our primary SONET platform. The manufacturers come out with a lovely next generation management software, but by the time we implement it, it's over $1,000 a node, and that's pretty much a non-starter for us. But it really is hopeful for the majority of our platforms. A lot of the early element managers and things were really pretty poor quality, and the manufacturers have realized that it's a competitive advantage for them to come up with a decent solution that's going to be effective and really provide a solution for a smaller provider. And so that's worked out really well for us, and we're very reliant on that because we just don't have scale to invest, really big dollars in some of the higher end tools. Thank you.
Wonderful. So that's, as you see, we've seen a big contrast across three operators, and it's important to keep in mind some of the lessons that each of them have just shared, and we'll be coming back to those. But let's dive into, a system vendor's perspective as to what is happening on the box advancements for better management and configuration.
Good morning, everybody. My name is Colby Barth, and I'm from Juniper Networks. So I'm going to talk a little bit about something that's not necessarily a new concept in Junos. It's been around for quite some time. Oops.
Excuse me, could we put this in display mode because in the slideshow mode. Sorry about that.
That's okay.
I didn't want them to end it. Hello?
I need to tell a joke or something.
Talk about the time when something happened in the management and something blew up. All right, we got it.
Oh, geez. What's going on with my slide deck? All right, so here we go. So, geez. All right, so I guess starting back over again here. Colby Barth from Juniper Networks. I'm going to talk about some on-box management and off-box management tools that we provide in Junos. Some of the guys here actually mentioned them already, so I'll breeze through some of it quickly. Like I said, it's not a new concept, so some of you should be, or hopefully you guys out there are semi-familiar with what I'm about to talk about. And I'll go into a couple examples and then some areas where we'd like to take the, take the solutions. So before I get started, what we've tried to provide you guys as operators is a framework, right? I don't purport to know your network better than you do, all right? And so the framework that we provide is hopefully something that is malleable enough for you guys to make use of through a standard XML API, right? So I forget which one of the guys here said they need standard interfaces from their vendors. You know, our goal is to provide that. We like to provide both on-box and off-box solutions. You know, you guys heard from the previous operators here that they have different needs, they have different solutions, and we're trying to sort of, make our solutions malleable in both. So our goal to make things better is to, one, eliminate errors, right? We want to keep you from making mistakes. We want to protect our own OS and our own systems from configuration errors. It helps everyone, not just you, but us as well. We want to be able to give you a framework where we can learn from what you need, from your specific requirements. We want to allow you to create your own business rules, create your own service framework, and allow you to implement that within these data structures. And then last but not least, hopefully this helps you save time, helps you reduce your OpEx, protects the network, and improves uptime. So I'm going to go through the next two very quickly. They're basically a regurgitation of the previous slides, but with just a little bit more detail. So as I mentioned, right, we want to enable you to create an off-box solution. You heard from Jay and John, and they use a remote configuration system to access their devices. We want to enable access to that, and we do that through this XML API and netconf. This one's automated. We want to create on-box solutions that basically do the same thing, right? We want to avert errors in configuration management. We want to save time through custom operational commands. And we want to help you speed resolution of issues when you have to put those hacks in place that we're talking about. So all of this can be done on-box and off-box through custom commands, event correlation, and then hopefully this simplifies your configurations, makes you enforce your own rule sets, and helps you from breaking your own rules. So Vishal asked us to focus on configuration management today. So while the framework that I just described has lots of different elements that I mentioned on the previous slide, I'm going to focus the remainder of the presentation really on just configuration management. So as was mentioned earlier, we have something called commit scripts. Commit scripts is an embedded Junos automation tool. And the idea of the commit scripts is to create rules that are hard to break, right? For lack of a better phrase, or lack of a better example, right? We want to, as an example, prevent human error from, say, accidentally deleting something that's mandatory. We want to enforce you to always have a description on your interface. I think I heard last night that a lot of information is gleaned from an interface description in our in router systems. So if we're missing the interface description or have a wrong interface description, it can actually wreak havoc on your own systems. So we need to possibly enforce that we have an interface description. We want to create various security and performance guidelines. We want to make sure your ACLs are configured correctly. These commit scripts can be used to enforce these rules, whether they be business rules, operations rules, what have you. And then last but not least, and I think this is fairly powerful, is router configurations get pretty complicated. I've been doing router configurations for a better part of 20 years now, and they're getting bigger and bigger and more complex and more complex. And as vendors, we keep making them more complex for you. So part of the goal of commit scripts in our Junos automation project is to simplify our configurations through sort of expansion of templated macros. And I'll actually show an example on the next slide. So this is a very basic example, and I'm going to expand on it in the next 2 slides. But this is basically a user-configured macro that is expanded through a commit script to, I guess, create these very complex router configurations. But you can see in the apply macro that just the basics are present for an operator to configure. Right? We have a customer name, we have an interface description, we have a QoS policy, we have their IP address, we have their interface, and we have their routing protocol and some BGP information. And when this configuration is expanded, it's expanded into hundreds of lines of code that is implemented, that makes that service for that customer implemented properly. And so again, we've minimized the configuration, simplified the configuration, and hopefully prevented a mistake from being made when implementing this customer service. In this example, this is slightly different, and I actually think this is extremely powerful. There's a few attributes of this example before I get into exactly what we're doing here. The first being is we're not necessarily just using a commit script to do what I'm about to show you. We're actually using an operational command called an op script, and that op script can be executed without allowing an operator to even go into sort of an exec level configuration mode. So if an operator is prevented from going into the configuration and actually being able to edit that configuration, they're basically unable to make any mistakes or wreak any havoc. So in the first part of the configuration, they execute an operational command that prompts them to answer a few questions, right? And those questions have a constrained set of answers that they can answer. And again, it's the same example: customer name, interface, IP address, security, QoS. It's simple stuff. And the answers to those questions are expanded to create the apply macro that you saw in the previous slide. Right, so now we have a constrained set of question and answer that an operator has to go through. It creates a macro that in turn is expanded into that same hundreds of lines of code, and the customer's configuration, it gets pushed to the router. And last but not least, we have something that we've been working on for the last year or two in the virtualization environment. And the goal of our Junosphere project is to create a virtualized environment for you to do a number of different things. And I'm going to focus here just on the configuration management aspect, but as I'm sure some of you are aware, you can probably do, this is a powerful example here that you can do a lot of things with. Basically, the idea is to be able to create a replica of your environment, whether it be your actual network, whether it be a version of your actual network, whether it be a lab environment, and then test whatever applications, whether they be services applications, whether they be commit scripts that I just described, whether it be anything against this virtualized environment. And so you can think of an example where I want to test the rollout of, some new configurations or even a new router OS prior to actually doing it. Instead of doing it on 2 or 3 routers in your lab for a portion of your network, you could actually roll it out on an exact replica of your network in a virtual environment and make sure that it works, it's functioning, and doesn't wreak havoc on the real world. And that's it for me. For you guys who are referencing the slides later, there's some references here, then some contacts within Juniper that you can reach out to if you have questions.
Great. Well, thank you very much, all. So let's jump directly into the Q&A part. If there are questions from the audience, we can take some of those, or I'll kick off with some discussions, and then as people get more thoughts, we can get audience questions as well. So let's give priority to the audience. So you heard, just to summarize, 3 different perspectives from operators, starting a perspective from Bruce, starting out with service management, service configuration, and then lastly, some capabilities that come from the vendor side in terms of doing the commit scripts so that the errors are minimized, but then also the virtualization environment, which helps you to at least potentially test out new services. So let's kick it off. And I'd like to ask all the panelists, we've heard a lot of different opinions, but the main thing is, from the purposes of takeaways, there are certain principles that I think we can extract from this, certain strategy principles for how we should do network management. So what I'd like to do is maybe ask each of you, starting with Jay and Sean, if you could very quickly say, from all of this that you've discussed and we've heard the different panelists, if there are 2 or 3 different points in terms of a network management strategy that you would advise somebody on, what would they be and what have they been for you?
I think probably the first and foremost for us is the configuration management database, having your network documented outside of the actual network itself, and then being able to return to that, whether it's an emergency situation or when you're actually doing a new design or whatever else. Having that's a pretty powerful portion of it. And then the second piece of that is auditing. Since we do allow people to make changes directly on the devices as well as through the configuration side, configuration management side, matching those 2 things up through an audit system program and programmatically looking at them each day, each week, depending on what you're looking for, and then fixing the changes that are different, is pretty powerful as well. It definitely saves your butt many times.
And continuing with that, Sean, I think you also have a lot of value on auditing, and for you it's particularly important because you're using the interface parameters for billing purposes as well. So maybe you could talk a little bit about that.
Yes, I mean, I would generally echo what Jay had to say, and I would say that, at the very least, if you're not running rancid or some equivalent, you're being negligent. And, so first is to get device backups and then start templating your common configurations. If your engineers aren't lazy, like Jay said, if you have engineers that enjoy doing the same work every day, find new engineers, because you really want engineers that want to get all that repetitive stuff off their plates.
No, and I think the important point is that once you get the repetitive stuff off the plate, there is room in the plate to do more interesting stuff, like offering new services with video and enhanced Ethernet and so forth, all of which requires a lot of brain power. So it's not as though you're making yourself redundant. You're making the redundant work go down in priority so you can free yourself up for something more interesting. And we have something from the audience, so please go ahead.
Yes, hi, that's Owen Roth, Impulse Advanced Communications. So I heard 2 things about sort of catastrophe mitigation, right? We heard one about a virtualization engine within Juniper. And we heard one from, I believe it was Jay, about peer review. So I was curious if there was automated catastrophe mitigation, and that may sound a little bit silly, but I'm thinking here about multiple tiers of waiving out that configuration, or if there was a best practice, or if we just pushed all the configuration out at once. So I'm thinking here, is there a concentric circle method that is preferred by the panel, or if they could speak to that? Thank you.
Sure. Anybody want to tackle that?
Well, so in our case, generally, the way that we approach this stuff is, like I said, the first step for any large config change is going to be to update the templates. There'll be peer review of the templates within the development organization. At that point, then we'll move on to lab testing of the templates. And generally, what we try to do, especially for large changes, is stage them, and we'll pick a limited production deployment to roll out the changes, and then if no issues are found, then it depends on the change. We might continue to roll it out incrementally, or if we have a high level of confidence in the change, then we'll just roll it out to the rest of the network.
And I think AOL has a different approach, and then we'll get Bob's view as well.
I was just going to speak to the actual kind of catastrophe situation. We haven't had one. Thank you. Hopefully there's some wood in here somewhere. But from the tabletop exercises and other types of BCDR drills that we do, very much concentric. I mean, it depends on how bad the disaster is and where it is, right? So if it's localized, then you don't have to worry about kind of building your local stuff first. But depending on if your out-of-band network is truly out-of-band and has absolutely no dependence on your running network, it makes it a little bit easier, but then how does your out-of-band get restored, things like that. So, we haven't necessarily drilled down to it. I think we have to wait for that particular catastrophe to find out how it's going to go, and hopefully we never experience it. And if we do, we have the configurations in the emergency mode, as well as can we regenerate the configurations. The ones in the emergency mode, though, are full configs. I mean, it's just rancid like a lot of people use no matter what. So that would definitely be our kind of default answer until we could get all the different subcomponents of the configuration system back up and running to build it back out.
Okay, thank you.
All right. And then I guess going on the same thought, we've talked a lot about systematizing things here on this panel, but I think there are some caveats that we also want to keep in mind. For example, what happens when you have devices with different capabilities, or what happens when you have devices with maybe different types of devices because you're dealing with legacy equipment and new equipment. So I think that's an important point that we need to focus on. So what are the opinions of the operators and the others on the panel on what you need to watch out for?
Well, one of our challenges is it's clear we need to, build, further tool sets and automation, but it's a question of return. At this point, we're doing, a lot of manual configuration, but really we're, taking on an awful lot as a small carrier, in that we're dealing with carrier Ethernet, we're selling wavelength services, we're doing fiber channel, we have really ramped up, are doing a huge amount of EVC transport, as well as IP services. We're transitioning from TDM to IP voice. Frankly, it's pretty overwhelming in terms of having to maintain the legacy structures and the newer structures. So at what point do you start diverting capital dollars that generate revenue into building these support structures? And so really it's trying to find that point at which it really starts becoming worthwhile to put the money into the support systems, and to flesh them out. And at this point, again, a lot of the tool sets are frankly out of reach of a smaller carrier. So we've been, very fortunate that, the industry, in terms of our hardware vendors, are really stepping up to the plate for us. And we're very excited with some of the new tool sets. And so we're going to, really aggressively implement those at this point. But, again, we really see that we need to do more. But really, you just got to find the tipping point at which, it becomes worth the investment.
There's a question from the audience.
Phil Schaefer, Juniper Networks. To your point and to the earlier question about repetitive engineering actions, do you monitor what your engineers do and post-mortem inspect it to see if they're doing the jobs that can and should be automated? Is there a process in place to do that sort of work?
Jay?
For AOL and...
Not so much from what the engineers do just on a day-to-day basis. Certainly postmortems from outages or situations where things go wrong. And we definitely learn what levels of automation we can do from that. I mean, a very recent example, we're not necessarily secretive like we used to be. A very recent example in the past week or so was just a simple decommission of an ACL line across, the backbone routers, or actually the data center routers. And that very simple thing of just pinging the IP before you decom the ACL. It's a pretty straightforward thing that you can easily automate. Something we've missed, we've just been really fortunate, or the past times it's come up, we haven't had a chance to put that in the automation. That'll be in the automation in the next few weeks for sure. So for the ones that are causing outage, certainly a postmortem and how can we make sure that doesn't happen again through automation, big part of it. But just the day-to-day stuff, we don't look at every single thing that goes on. There's just a lot of changes all day long.
So you don't look to categorize and identify what your network engineers do in their day-to-day work to figure out where automation makes sense and where you get your ROI?
Not in some kind of systematic method. It's up to the managers, the different teams. We have 3 different network engineering teams, and those managers with those 6 or 7 employees in each of those teams would pay attention
But
to it.
that's an excellent suggestion. I mean, that is definitely something that an organization could do. And in fact, that was the suggestion also, that's what Jay said, and then Sean echoed that if you're as a network engineer, I mean, one of the things that organizationally is good to put as a best practice is this thought process that you should be looking at what are the things in your daily tasks that can be automated. And even if you yourself may not do that, at least that thought process starts to move the organization in a direction where you start thinking about how you can do it, get tools outside or develop on your own or get the additional talent to make that happen.
I would say, from our perspective, automation is so ingrained in the way that we operate things. Basically, everything that we do more than once, we look at to see if we can automate it. And, like I said, our engineers are lazy in what I would call a good way. And that, if they see, they're taking a circuit out for maintenance, 5 times a night every night, and they have a certain number of steps that they have to go through to do that, well, then generally they'll come back to the development organization and say, can we get a tool that will do this? And so we don't have any systematic review of what people are doing, but it just tends to bubble back up to the development organization as far as developing automation tools for that.
Next question.
So, quick poll for the guys that develop.
Could you please introduce yourself?
Oh, sure. Robin Pimentel with Gaikai. For the guys that have database-driven configuration management systems, can you talk a little bit about how you get the data in there, what your engineers do day to day to commit code, whether you use revision control or using web front ends, et cetera?
So for us, there's two primary interfaces into the database. One is a Unix CLI client, and then the other one is a web UI. So that is, I mean, 99% of the activity that happens on our network happens through those two interfaces.
And do you have, I assume the CLI has commit type functions and things like that?
No, I mean, it's data entry, essentially.
Okay.
I mean, our operations engineers, to some extent, this is simplifying, but they're data entry operators.
Yeah, I understand. How do you verify the integrity of the actual configurations in the database, right?
So what's in our database is parameters, not configuration per se.
I see.
The configuration all lies in the templates, and the templates are just pulling out variables from the database and inserting those essentially into the templates and
And the
then spitting
templates
out
are
an
revision
entire
controlled?
device config.
And the templates are revision controlled?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, so the templates are all maintained by the development organization.
Okay. All right.
Jay, do you have a thought?
Very similar Unix-based tool, Simian that I was speaking of. And then as far as it's mostly perimeter-based versus the full configuration-based. Another aspect, I forgot what it was, but yeah.
And then one of the questions was, how does the integrity of those templates, you talked about templates, so how does the integrity of the template get verified? Is that done during the design phase? That's the peer review process that's already verified?
Right. So the generally what happens is our development team is split up. We have, like I said, 3 software developers, and then we have 4 network developers that do hardware and software qualification and feature development. So generally, the network developer will create the initial version of the configuration on the device, and then generally they'll actually spin up the template as well, and then send that over to the actual tools team for review of the template and a sanity check of it, and it's reviewed by the other members of the team. And then depending on the scale of the change, then we'll work with our operations organization to actually get that pushed out to the production devices.
So once the template's done, it's only the parameters that are changing, and so the template doesn't change until something major happens.
Exactly.
Wonderful. So I guess one of the things that we talked about is, okay, we got to configure the network, but then what happens? Maybe it's good to also think a little bit about what happens when you roll back something. How does that work? What are the processes to do that? What systems or methods are deployed to do that? Is that an issue?
Well, so in our case, the templates are all in revision control, right? So if there was a problem with the template, you would just revert the template out of revision control, and you would rebuild all the configurations in the box and push them back out to the devices. If it was a case where there were some catastrophic bug, that was causing a huge problem, then we would actually just go log into the devices and roll back their configurations, or cut and paste in the case of iOS devices.
Bob, can you talk about, I mean, you have a large number of devices, so how do you handle disaster recovery or rollback?
Yeah, at this point, I mean, a lot of our configuration is still all manual. So, I mean, if you're going to have to pull, you're going to go in and pull lines of code out. So, I mean, that's the issue of, at which point do we start to automate all the core? One of the big changes for us is a lot of our devices now, or in the past, had been where we have actually layer 3 devices at the prem. And all the new structures are all based on that they're all layer 2 carrier Ethernet transport to the premise. So then that's pushing more of that centralized back to the core, which will lend itself to automation. When you have a lot of distributed layer 3 devices, it becomes more challenging. So we're excited that as we move ahead, we think the path to automation will become easier for us. But right now, the biggest kinds of problems that we have is someone didn't remove an old static route or something from an old customer, and go to provision the new customer, and then you figure out, well, it's not working.
And then for disaster recovery, you're using vendor-based systems where, your SIP phones, or you mentioned that about the power, that maybe that's worth talking about. Something knocks, your power situation knocks out a piece of equipment, and then you have to replace the config.
Yeah, one of the most common types of problems that we have is, a lot of these edge devices, the power supplies are, not terribly robust. They just, you lose devices once in a while. So you've got to roll a service tech, you've got to find that config, get it restored, and that's kind of the most common activity we have. Past that, we at this point we really rely on Rancid for all the core routers. We maintain redundant hardware, for all the classic 72s and such. So you're going to be just restoring config off of Rancid.
Okay, and then going back to something we were talking about earlier, which is you can systematize things quite a bit. But there are issues when you have, which I was talking about earlier, which is when there are different types of device capabilities, and also, so Jay, we were discussing this offline, where and even with you, Sean, where the device capabilities can vary, and you have to keep that in mind. So it's not just blind systematization that we are looking at. So maybe you want to talk a little bit about that and your opinion on that.
Sure. We haven't done as good of a job as we could have of kind of putting in place this system is capable of these types of features and functionalities. What we generally do is we pick, device types. Even though I say we have lots of devices in the network, it's generally, if it's serving this function, it's a single device type. Mm-hmm. So that if you're configuring the peering routers, that those are probably going to be MX960s from Juniper. So when you're looking at doing portions of the configuration for those devices, you kind of already understand those capabilities. Now, for hardware revisions or things like that, we do our best to make sure that if there's something that's been outdated and we start using a new version that has different capabilities, that we go back and retrofit. And I think we do a pretty good job of that at this point. But it depends on how much money you can spend and how willing your vendors are to work with you to make sure that you have cross-compatibility on their own device lines. And then different places have different needs.
So Colby, coming to the device types, I mean, any vendor has multiple device types. So how are you guys helping the operators handle the configuration when you have multi-devices from, let's say, yourself or even other vendors? What is your strategy for that?
Well, so I think these guys mentioned it earlier, right? Our goal is to provide a standard open interface for configuration management. Specifically at Junos, we only deal with Junos. We don't have multiple versions of software. So it isn't necessarily a challenging problem. The features that I spoke of are embedded in our OS. Everything in Junos is XML. So when new software revisions come out, new features come out, all of the tools that I just mentioned become instantly available.
Okay, great. There's a question from the audience.
Thank you. I'm Frank Weiner from Cyan, and my question is for Jay. It looks like AOL has invested heavily in developing a lot of in-house software, and that's a big investment. Were you able to quantify the savings that you achieved as a result of those investments?
Kind of like Sean, I won't say we invested heavily and in a very specific manner. We use network engineers who could also, write code in decent ways. I mean, there's a big difference between hacking code like I would do and someone who actually logically think out, this is the program I want to write and create. We have a couple of those folks who do that. The creator of Simian is no longer with AOL, created that framework off of the other framework and then, picked up by another, what I would call, definitely a software engineer, not just, he happens to be a network engineer or a security engineer in the past, but he's taken those skills and switched it over. And then from that standpoint, it's a lot of self-grown internal stuff. The infrastructure development organization, definitely all professional software engineers, that is their day jobs. And in that case, if you have X dollars of revenue, you look at a percentage of that and say, how much are we actually going to invest to create the tools to then offset? I mean, we went from about 150 to almost 200 people, if you add up enterprise networking as well as production networking and things like that, back about 5 years ago, and with VJ Gill and everybody else was at AOL, to less than 50 people now, handling all of the network structure. So it's a third of the people, but about the same size network. We haven't really shrunk the network at all. We haven't necessarily grown the network, but it's stayed about the same size the entire time. So, that kind of savings.
Thank you.
I would also say for us, it was an organic process, so there's no easy way to calculate a direct ROI. What we do know is that we essentially have a strategic independence from any vendor-provided solutions. So I'm not tied to any specific vendor for a platform. If I want to bring in a new platform, I can develop my own tools to support that platform, and I don't have to worry about deploying the vendor's NMS system in order to deploy the platform.
And you also said something about the size of your organization relative to what a similar sized operator elsewhere might have. Maybe that's another way to quantify, right?
Right.
The
I mean,
staff
we
that
don't
you have.
run any hard numbers. I can't tell you we've saved 25% in operating costs over the years, but we know both. Realistically, we know our OPEX is low. We do well, and we know that we have, like I said, an independence from the tyranny of vendor-provided NMSs.
Okay.
I have one question from the chat room, but what's the role OSS teams in the product development and rollout cycle? So you get them involved, in the product development stage and doesn't roll out until the tools are ready, or people can respond to that.
So what's the roles of the OSS teams in the product development cycle?
For us, I mean, we have a very small organization, so we work really closely with both our, for us, there isn't a huge separation between product development and network development, and we work really closely with the OSS teams to basically quantify what data needs to be duplicated between the configuration tools and the OSS system. So for us, being a fairly small organization, even though we run a large network, it's really not much of a challenge.
But the other interesting point is that your interface is directly feeding into your billing system, right? I mean, you're collecting, you mentioned that that's kind of unique to what you're doing, that the billing system
we have a
directly-
separate billing system, but all of the billing system is, seeded from the configuration
From the
tool. So all of the interface and router data actually comes directly out of the configuration tools and is fed into the billing system.
So that's again an interaction between the OSS guys and the management folks. Any opinion from this side of the house about interaction with OSS teams, what you've seen from your experience, Bruce?
Yeah, I want to give a different perspective, obviously, because I'm a software vendor versus being on the inside. And what I have found is a couple paradigms of things that have been discussed here is that you have to look at your organization, what is the best route of way that you're going to build your business as far as coming back with a return on investment, as far as building your own internal tools or bringing an external tool into the house. And as far as working with different OSS development groups, what I've found actually the paradigm has actually changed in the last couple of years. Believe it or not, a lot of the inquiries that we get for software tools are not coming from the OSS and traditional engineering and IT side of the house any longer. They're coming from marketing, where marketing is coming back to us and saying, we want to push out this new service. Our internal IT OSS side is having a difficult getting that service to market. Do you have something that could help us? And for me to be able to work with the marketing side of the house is such a 180 of where I used to be before, because I would always start working with the OSS side of the house and the tool side of the house. But trying to pull all those groups together is slightly different. So just going back to the question as far as what is your return of ROI, my answer is always to take a look at your organization. I'm not trying to eliminate anybody's position or anybody's job function, it's just make them more efficient. Maybe they could be doing something else. So I think the game has changed, and obviously going to the future the game is changing. It's something that each organization has to take a close look about how they best operate.
Well, great. We have a couple minutes, so I'm just going to ask everyone to quickly, if you have some last-minute comments about lessons learned or things that people should keep in mind, then we can go around and quickly wrap up from the panel's perspective.
Well, again, it's just as a small provider, we're trying to figure out at what point, we can really evolve and continue to grow to the next level. We're constantly, straining at, rolling out. Because we are smaller, it's easy to roll out new products, but it's also, makes it more difficult simultaneously to build those support systems because you do have limited resource. So, that's our challenge is we're able to be small and nimble, but at the same time, it's really a challenge then to also, have those support structures in place.
So your message is, as you said earlier, from the greater support from the vendors and more cost-effective tools in the bracket that you're looking at, right?
Yeah, the vendors are really kind of getting it now, where they're able to help build solution sets. So it's not just the hardware, but it's actually the service activation tools, as well as just a pure element management and configuration management. They're really starting to get more robust. A lot of the early tools we were getting were just awful.
Excellent.
But they're really starting to pull together with some decent tool sets.
Wonderful. Bruce?
I mean, just to add to that as well, it's interesting. I mean, in the last 20 years, I sold to carriers directly, and so what we're finding now that actually we're working with a lot of the manufacturers to embed our solution set in their NMS and other tools that they have. So this way, as far as the end user, they might not realize that it's an outside party software that's being embedded in that solution set. And so that's an interesting change of thought, the way that business is being done. So, I mean, there's still ways that you can do things, internal development, external development, and actually receiving tool sets, like you said, that are much more powerful. And I think you're going to be seeing that in the future. That is, what your vendor could offer you is something much more to your liking as far as helping you do your business on a day-to-day basis.
Jay, you had said something about that, and I think Sean had echoed that no tool will eventually do everything. So maybe you want to close with that thought.
Sure. Thinking, if you look at the Opsware or some of the stuff in the past, it's supposedly the Uber tool that can do all kinds of things for you in so many different situations. It gets hard to actually implement and or use. So think of that, keep that in mind. Write your point solutions, but if you're going to write point solutions, try and have a framework that your point solutions can conform to so that lots of people can use them and update them after you leave. And, very specifically, just a note to the vendors, if you're not giving us automated ways to configure devices and you're still thinking that we need to go to some CLI and do some massive text file edit, you're way, way behind. And it's going to make it a lot less attractive to use you for our devices versus somebody that's using netconf or XML type configurations.
Wonderful. Sean?
Yeah, I mean, I would just stress that you can do this in some way, shape, or form. And so start looking for those opportunities where you can start to leverage automation and start to build on that. Like I said, one of the things that I really wanted to stress with this was an organic process. It's not something where you have to go from 0 to 100 immediately. You can take small incremental steps to get there.
That's very important, that you can take small incremental steps. Colby, closing thoughts?
My only closing thought would be, in the past few years we've seen, or at least I've seen, a number of instances where routers are carrying configuration that's unneeded. Keep those configurations up to date, clean and lean, and differentiate between boxes doing different things. It'll save system resources and keep things running smooth.
Yeah, that's the other important point. I think you mentioned that you don't want to take the edge configurations and apply them to core routers because they are much more detailed than the core routers. So you need to keep in mind the functionality of the device. So just to sum it all up, I mean, we learned that you can increase the quality of your network and the quality of the staff and what they're able to do with more efficient network management. We saw a variety of different approaches. Peer reviews are important. Avoid hacks and one-offs. Audits is very important, and that's something you need to do no matter what you configure. If you're configuring different types of devices, keep in mind the fact that they have different capabilities, so not everything is going to work for every kind of device, and you need to keep that in mind as you're looking at the network, and systematize the configuration as far as possible, not just of the devices, but even of the services, which is where a lot of the service management components come in. So with that, I'd like to close the panel. I'd like to give a big hand to all the panelists, because some of them have come as far from the East Coast. A couple of them just traveled just for this panel. They came yesterday. They're going to leave tonight. So I think that's a good testament to their ability to share their information with us. Thank you again.
So we've got a break coming up, sponsored by Torrey Point and Subspace Communications. Remember, fill out your surveys. We've got some great giveaways still to come, and there aren't that many people filling out the surveys, so you have a good chance of winning. Thanks. See you at 11:30.